A reading from the Gospel of John. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. When we read today's gospel, most of us in the present day read this story literally, and as a result focus on the miracle that happens in the story. After all, that's what the story says happened, so that's how it happened. However, your friendly neighborhood atheist, who also treat the story literally, wouldn't accept this premise. Miracles are, by their very definition, not scientific, and therefore cannot be what happened. As a result, if a miracle isn't what happens, then there has to be a natural explanation, like the premise that they started out with 5 loaves and 2 fish, but when this food got spread out to the masses, a ton of people felt guilty and decided to share the food that they actually had and were hoarding for themselves. No matter what side you are on, even though I assume most, if not all, of you would be on the Christian side of the spectrum, this literal interpretation of the story makes it seem like it's a black and white story. Either it literally happened, or it didn't. This is very much how we see stories like this in a 21st century context. However, it would be fitting for us to realize that this story was written down around 20 centuries ago. A lot can change over 2,000 years. After all, in the 1st century, it was quite commonplace for miracles to happen. Miracles were a dime a dozen in the ancient world. And clearly, if you are the evangelist who is writing this story, you wouldn't even be considering the possibility that it literally didn't happen. It was never a consideration. As a result, if they aren't considering whether this miracle literally happened or not, there clearly has to be a third interpretation for this story. And this third interpretation isn't focused on the literal meaning of the story at all, but goes beyond what the story literally says. It asks the question, what does this story mean? For John's community, it's quite easy to see what the story means for them. First, of course, Jesus is the bread of life, which would get explained further at the end of chapter 6. Second, moreover, the story says that Jesus is the one who keeps them spiritually fed. Only through Jesus are they made whole. Feeding on Jesus is what keeps them going in a world where they were continually being oppressed at the hands of the Roman Empire. As a modern-day example, if any of you are fans of the Eagles, one of their songs states, "When we're hungry, love will keep us alive." This gospel totally speaks to that fact. The love of Jesus keeps them alive, not just in good times, but more importantly, during bad times. And John's community was definitely going through some really tough times, specifically being kicked out of the synagogues and, by extension, being excommunicated from Judaism, the religion that they were raised from birth. So, as a result, a good question would be, is it okay for us to ask the question of whether Jesus literally multiplied 5 loaves and 2 fish to such an extent that they had 12 wicker baskets full of leftovers? Sure. It's absolutely okay to ask. There's nothing wrong with that. My favorite theologian, Marcus Borg, had a perfect way of answering such a question when he asks, "Believe whatever you want about whether it really happened or not. Now, let's talk about what the story means."